Dr. Marian's mission in life is to make learning as natural as breathing. Marian provides technical practices that integrate with everyday work and create sustainable habits that shape the organization's technical culture. Dr. Marian, thank you very much for being with us. We're excited to hear from you. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so very much. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are tuning in from. I'm really honored to be here at Craft. This is my first time. I had been invited a couple years ago, but then a certain pandemic came into place. So I'm really happy to be able to be here finally. I am really excited to talk to you about how empathy can help make tests easy and code safe. Of course, there's no silver bullet, but these techniques certainly make it easier. I am a learning designer by trade and a co-founder with Arlo Belshee, where we found Deep Roots, which is focused on refactoring and training refactoring principles and techniques. All right, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video because it distracts me, and then really focus on the actual talk that I'm going to be giving. Before we get started, though, I did want to say to you that all the resources from this talk are in a web page, and they're linked to this QR code. No worries, right now, I'm going to show it again. But so you'll have time to scan it at the end of the talk. So I wanted to give you a heads up. And so you can just sit back, relax, don't worry about writing anything down, unless, of course, you want to tweet at Dig Deep Roots. We love active tweeting. All right, so let's dive in. Empathy is awesome. You already recognize its value, otherwise you might have chosen a different session. However, we all know from experience in companies that business problems are what's going to drive behavior. This means empathy usually takes a back seat. It is only used if it's convenient to the business problem. At least this has been our experience. So let's start with what the business problem is. We always have to be productive. When we are productive, it almost always requires making code changes. This means features, processes, etc. This kind of productivity. The business problem is, while it does require making code changes, any change adds risk. This is really every developer's least favorite catch-22 when it comes to legacy code. You can't change it without tests, and you can't test it without changing it. So the most common technique to reducing risk is automated testing, but some code simply can't be tested, which is really what we're talking about today. The safest strategy, of course, is simply to not test the untestable code, but this means that we have to avoid a code base. We tend to be avoiding a code base or try to not implement a feature in order to minimize risk. So that's not a particularly sustainable strategy, at least not for business. So I'm somebody who doesn't code fingers and keyboard, but I do make a living in metaphors. So I couldn't help, while working with Arlo on these refactoring techniques, how much this compares to PDFs. We want PDFs because we don't want a perfectly good enough document that we already understand to be changed. But the reality is we have to make changes. In the world of code, not only do developers need to add features, but they want to improve the design. These are good ideas. These are good things to be adding. Both the features and the design improvement mean we have to change our proverbial PDF, though, and that's where it becomes problematic. There's nothing so terrifying as receiving an edited document without track changes. For the developer, these are the changes that bring not only the possibility of bugs, but an unknown amount of hours finding them when they cause problems somewhere completely unrelated. After all, it's not like you can test this untestable code before integration. And so cycle of panic is now complete. So we work really hard to avoid this cycle of panic. The first knee-jerk response, of course, is to maintain this illusion of control. I can make changes, but you cannot. In my words, you can create your own PDF, but don't mess with my PDF. In development speak, this means you can add features, but you don't want to refactor. You can't refactor. But then, of course, came the PDF editor. This breaks our illusion of control. I actually was horrified with the PDF editor. I didn't want anybody touching my PDFs. This is the same thing as developers refactoring without permission. Managers really dislike code changes without permission. So we finally get to the point where we know this code needs change, this horrible, gnarly, difficult code. It's going to have to get changed. So here's our classic solution. We're going to call a meeting. We'll work on it together. We'll achieve consensus if we're very, very, very lucky. And then we'll lock it back down to keep an illusion of control over this risk. This is expensive. It's painful. It's an absolute last resort. Like I said, we'll do anything to avoid this cycle of panic. So the obvious solution is to make our code testable so every detail doesn't need controlled. That would be really nice. They say that refactoring will make the code testable and reduce future bugs. This is great. But that in itself is a change. Is it worth making that first change? Is it actually worth risking a bug now to reduce the risk of adding bugs when I add the features later? So taking this back into my little world of PDFs here, let's say my PDF is one of 50 nearly identical contracts we use worldwide. This is an example that I've made up, so this is not correct. It's just an example. So the contract references licenses, but using that term adds legal responsibilities in the EU. Again, me making this up. So it adds the risk of a lawsuit. The fix to this hypothetical situation is to change all contracts to reference access grants because it doesn't have any specific meaning. So is it worth the risk to change all the contracts to avoid future lawsuits? Or is it better to leave it working as is and hope the lawsuit never shows up? So we have this exposure. We know what it is. We could fix it by adding access grants to all the contracts. It should fix it. But now we have an unknown risk. They don't know what else gets changed in the contract if they simply switch out the terms. And then to bring it right into the world of every tired manager's nightmare, this org doesn't know which customer depends on that exact language. So every manager who values their job is going to accept the known risk. This is why we're so often not given permission to refactor. It's our job to both reduce that risk and make the risks knowable. To be clear, reducing risk and making the risks knowable have been solved since the 1980s. We have refactoring that doesn't change behavior. If you've read Martin Fowler's work, we have automated tests, we have tools, but change that is causing risk is still showing up as a problem. And finally, we're going to get to my topic where I add the element of system empathy. Where does that come in? So just to give you a little bit of a backstory, when Arlo and I started working together to make Deep Roots, one of the more powerful effects that I noticed of his discipline refactoring processes is the amount of systemic level empathy that was naturally involved without intentionality. I'm going to show you a closer look at it through the lens of my brain. So this is the big picture of his naming as a process, one of the early processes that we teach at Deep Roots. Each naming stage makes the code one increment more testable, giving trust to the names and dropping off hours of reading code. So here's how Arlo's explanation struck me. Not having put fingers to code before, well, I have, but we're not going to go there right now. It sounded like contract migraines of my past life. How many of us, whether professionally or personally, have seen this wall of text for a contract? There are a slew of problems that make this high risk to change. We have too much that's unknown. We have so much reading time to even understand the intent ahead of us. It's easy to misunderstand the intent. If we change one thing, we might not see another thing. that is unknowingly dependent. And then we might change more than we meant to. This is tit for tat, exactly what developers face in legacy code. So we're going to start naming the process with this contract. As we can see here, there are missing names. So our goal is to get to the next stage, obvious nonsense. And we'll just do a quick kind of demo refactoring of how this shows up in a way that is, yes, you get results, but it creates a natural systemic empathy for your team and for your managers, product owners, and other individuals impacted by this code. So getting to obvious nonsense requires us to identify things that should be named, but they aren't. We find one thing at a time and then do the refactoring that I'm going to call extract definition. Extract definition creates a name, and we're going to use an obvious nonsense name. And you're just like, why would we use a nonsense name? And the reason for that is we find large unwieldy chunks in contracts, yes, and then also in big methods. We can't easily name them yet. We watch devs get so much decision fatigue trying to find this perfect name. And frankly, it's going to be more likely misleading because the dev doesn't have all the information. So in our quest here, we find that the same text is repeated 3 times. So that seems an obvious that we can extract and name. So we're not going to try and get to a good name. We just want to find the chunks that we're going to name later. So we extract it as applesauce and we move on. Just extracting applesauce has reduced the name of the contract by half. As you can see on the left side, there's the contract. On the right top side, there's the contract again. Sometimes, though, the definition we extracted is still too complicated. In this case, we see a long list of nouns inside the definition for applesauce: designs, discoveries, inventions, products, computer programs, procedures. Oh my goodness, long list. So we're going to do the same extract definition refactoring to pull out these nouns. And now we have an even shorter and cleaner definition for applesauce. Applesauce means all dinguses, all artifacts basically, made, blah, 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 blah. Repeating this many more times, we have now gotten to the obvious nonsense stage. Our contract's already really much easier to read, even with these nonsense names like consultants hereby schleps applesauce, including but not limited to any pear sauce to company. Okay, we have no idea what schleps, applesauce, or pear sauce is, but we're starting to get a flow of the intent and we can still see what the definitions actually are. Just like with obvious nonsense, we get to honest very incrementally. Like the previous example I gave you would have happened multiple times in order to even get to schleps, get to applesauce, get to pear sauce, get to pones, get to do things. So same thing again, becoming honest is a series of refactorings. So we want to look at each definition and make sense of it because applesauce is officially not super helpful. So what is applesauce? What is dinguses? So we then do the refactoring rename definition to include that one true thing. In this case, I know that dinguses is simply a list of artifacts that have been created. So I'm just going to rename dinguses to created things. That's pretty clear to me. I know that these are things that have been created. Meanwhile, I know that applesauce has something to do with work, but there's more to it. So I renamed it work and other stuff. By adding other stuff, I'm indicating to all developers in this code base and myself that there's more. So really good idea to read that one. And this is why we call this stage honest. We're being brutally honest, even when we don't know something. Repeating this step several times gets us to the honest stage. So just say we did this multiple times, here is what it could look like at the end. Consultant hereby conveys and things, work and other stuff, included but not limited to, blah, 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 with a definition of what work and other stuff means. So we're getting to something that is more, at least gives us a clue as to the context of what's going on. To become completely honest, we need to get rid of other stuff. Like, what does that mean? So we have to give every fact that other stuff represents in this name. And you're like, this is a really long name. Yes, it's a really long name, but it's much better to be able to read the long name than having to read, interpret, analyze, and possibly make the wrong guess inside the method. So in this case, work and other stuff has several important facts. The process would have been several renamings, but this final completely honest name is now any intellectual property made or referenced or used. So yes, it's a mouthful, and I have zero doubt of what's in that. So after performing this refactoring 20 times or more, we get to the completely honest stage for this contract. So now imagine being able to read a contract that says, consultant hereby transfers and assigns any intellectual property made or referenced or used, including but not limited to any legal protections to company, blah, 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 blah. It's true. I don't know the nuanced details of those definitions, but I really get the intent. I understand that I'm transferring and assigning basically anything that I do to the company, which is not cool, by the way. So I already have a clue that there's a problem with this that I need to address. This is the readability that naming as a process gives. And this is a natural place where empathy is building, because as we are defining these and renaming over and over and over, we are making it so much more legible to everybody else on our team and anybody else who touches our code base. So this is the first stage where the contract is actually completely readable. We can still make more improvements. The naming process does continue, but you can now read the contract without reading the list of definitions, and you can get a really accurate understanding of the agreement. If you remember what the previous wall of text was, this is a huge improvement. So let's recap this refactoring journey that we just took really quick. We took a wall of text, or in dev speak, a really long, painful method, and we created obvious nonsense. Consultants hereby schleps applesauce, including but not limited to any pear sauce to the company. The company pwns applesauce, including the right to do things. Yeah, I don't exactly know what's going on here, but it's better than the wall of text because now I can see the flow. Then we created honesty. Consultants hereby conveys and things, work and other stuff, including but not limited to any legal protections to the company. The company owns and stuff, work and other stuff, including the right to protect or use or do other things. So this is already better because we can tell the subject. We know we're in the domain of intellectual property. We know the company is trying to take a lot of it. Finally, we created completely honest. Consultants hereby transfers and assigns any intellectual property made or referenced or used, including but not limited to any legal protections to company. The company owns and controls any intellectual property made or referenced or used, including the right to protect or use or do other things. So this stage leaves no room to guess. It also shows that the contract is trying to take way too much intellectual property from the consultant. So if the consultant basically uses any code anywhere in the world, that company now owns it. So that's a bug that is now obvious. You just witnessed a non-coding application of half the naming as a process. There are a couple more stages to the naming as a process, but I think we've accomplished my point. It's not just about naming, it's about breaking things up so that every piece can stand on its own and be clearly noted for what it does. This is what makes it safer and testable, and bringing it back to empathy. What would make this readable? What would make it easier for other people to understand? What would not waste people's time having to read this terribly long method? Thinking in that term really makes this safer to work with. It's not fast to get through all the stages, but there is actually a remarkable speed in the results when it becomes a process for the team. But wait, wasn't that literally just refactoring? If we're referring to the discipline refactoring as defined by Martin Fowler, then yes, it's an existing solution. So what's the big deal? We already know this. And in truth, it's not a specific technique. This system empathy is a state of thinking as we code. there's probably not many of you who feel safe in trusting names, if any of you feel that way. But if we name based on a process of which we can all rely on within that code base, then that in itself is empathy on a systemic level. So your empathy, how is this going to be easiest to understand, the clearest? And I know we already do this, we already try to name something perfectly, but if we just say exactly what it is and then exactly what we don't know, that is classic empathy for what other people are going to have to experience later. This is helping you see the effect on the system, and now the entire group is going to benefit. So essentially, we're coding for tiny readable pieces and we're making it testable, which ironically is easiest within a clear and understood process. So I know this was short, but there were so many other things I wanted to add in, but I wanted to keep the message really simple and clear, how empathy works as we code, when we code with this state of mind. Of course, we'd love for you to read the blog series Arlo wrote on the entire naming as a process, which you can find access in the QR code. And we also offer a free, mostly monthly newsletter and practical tips for handling legacy code. Now, if you're sitting there and thinking of a product owner or manager for whom you really wish they could have seen this to better understand the process and safety of refactoring, we do have a 1-hour class that we offer later this month, so that they are actually not only hearing it, but they're doing the refactoring through the contract that you saw, so that they can understand the value and the safety of refactoring and have a good conversation and start building that empathy across the different systems in the organization. And lastly, if you'd really like to get naming as a process in your fingers as a habit, join our public workshop next month. Just 1 hour a day of shared time for 2 weeks and lots of practice in your code base. All right, so now I'm going to open to questions and start my video. Please take a moment to scan this QR code, get the resources that are provided in this deck, and any other information you want on Deep Roots. Ricardo, do you have any questions that have come up as I went through that? I hope there are people out there.
Hello. Hi, sorry. Yes. I'm going to just check on our Slido. Currently, we don't have any questions. Like, you either were super self-explanatory or the topic is super niche. But I think that's also a good indication. Yes. First of all, can you hear me? You can hear me, right?
I can hear you.
Marian. Okay, great. All right, man. So with that, then I will say thank you very much for your topic. You said in the beginning that you're going to give, or that you're going to make your slides available. Can you just you showed a QR code, but where else can we find your presentation?
Well, let me just give you the direct link here in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
That is what the QR code will take you to. That's just the
all right
page.
All right, perfect, great. So thank you very much, Marian.